Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday, everybody. We need to begin with the property crisis, and boy, are things looking bad. According to preliminary data from China Real Estate Information Corp published yesterday, Thursday, the value of new home sales among the 100 biggest real estate companies in the country fell 29.6% from a year earlier to 330.1 billion yuan, approximately $55 billion US. This follows a 27.5% decline in October. Veteran China journalist Nerys Avery posted this chart today expressing, and just a warning, the following contains expletives, quote, "This is one bloody depressing chart. The housing market is so fucked. The decline in China's home sales accelerated in November as buyers remained wary of the turmoil in the country's real estate sector." End quote. According to the report, sales were down 4.1% month on month. The top 100 developers' aggregate annual sales are expected to fall 15% from 2022. This is despite now months of government measures to support the market. Now Beijing is considering further extreme policies which could endanger financial stability, including pushing banks to provide unsecured loans in the tens of billions to developers, many of which are on the edge of default or collapse. Why would the government do such a thing? We remember that a recent Nomura report estimates that approximately 20 million homes remain unfinished, and that about $500 billion US is needed to finish them, even though they have been paid for in full. This is $500 billion of dead cost. Either the government covers the bill with no return, or it doesn't, and households who have mortgages eat the cost with no home delivered. This, of course, creates social instability and potential financial stress if these households begin defaulting on mortgage payments and banks have no assets to take control of. Now, as we discuss this on the macro level, it's worth zooming into the human level to remind ourselves what this means for millions of regular middle-class and working-class Chinese. In a piece published this week called "The Human Cost of China's Property Crisis," UK-based The Financial Times speaks to a 42-year-old makeup artist from the city of Hefei in the poor eastern province of Anhui, surnamed Zhang. The outlet writes that Zhang had hoped to move into her new apartment with her elderly parents in August of this year, but 2 years after she paid a deposit for a 667 square foot flat costing 580,000 RMB, $80,000 US, it is still not finished, and she has been unable to get her deposit back from Evergrande. The reason she can't get the money is that the money is gone and Evergrande is bankrupt. An emotional Zhang, who works 3 jobs to cover a mortgage for a non-existent apartment, explains to the outlet, quote, "I emptied my savings to cover the deposit and down payment. I don't dare tell my parents the news. If I did, they would be worried sick." End quote. Last month, Zhang and other buyers staged protests at local government offices and Evergrande's sales offices. Later, the outlet reports, she received phone calls from local officials telling her not to organize any more protests. Zhang expressed to the Financial Times, quote, "How can the government allow it to collapse? How can this happen? I paid my part and Evergrande is not delivering. Now I can't even take a proper break. I can't sleep at night. I've lost my hair. And now I can't even cry a little bit about the grievances I have." End quote. This is just one of 20 million stories, and things are likely going to get worse. The task to stabilize the market generally remains challenging in the face of this broad-based decline in sales. Hey everyone, just quickly, if you think China Update adds some value and you'd like to see more episodes like this being made, the biggest way to help the channel grow is to subscribe, hit the bell notification, and hit the like button. This is a huge help, and it only takes a few moments to hit subscribe and like. And for anyone who wants to help keep the channel financially sustainable, primarily subscriber supported and not reliant on corporate sponsorship, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Chinese financial media outlet Eatsai reports this week that at least 16 Chinese municipalities are rolling out more measures, such as cutting taxes and offering subsidies to help people sell their second-hand properties in order to buy a new one and bolster the sluggish, newly built housing market. The outlet writes, quote, "New policies have made the sale of second-hand homes smoother in some places, but it is still difficult to sell a pre-owned home, as there are so many up for sale that closing a deal takes a very long time." End quote. Incredibly, a number of government-funded platforms and state-owned enterprises have even proposed buying up second-hand homes themselves. One of the biggest issues in the second-hand market, however, is that the highly inflated prices means rental yields are far too low. Yitai writes that it is hard for a long-term rental apartment operator to buy and manage second-hand homes, as the price of pre-owned homes is still too high and buyers are unlikely to make the money back by renting them out. Indeed, Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis expressed on this point this week, quote, "This is an important constraint. Rental yields are so low that it makes more sense to rent an apartment than to buy one, unless you expect property prices to rise rapidly. This implies that the only way to prevent prices from declining further is to reinflate the property bubble." End quote. Evidently, the wider housing industry remains very much in crisis. On Wednesday this week, Fitch Ratings wrote in a report, quote, "The year-on-year decline in national new home sales narrowed in September and October 2023 from the troughs in June through August following intense policy easing, but home buyers' sentiments remain fragile due to lingering concerns over private developers' ability to deliver projects on a timely basis with acceptable quality as more developers face tight liquidity." End quote. The same day, Nomura Holdings Inc. analysts wrote in a note, quote, "The impact of the property easing measures rolled out since August has run its course. New home prices in large cities have started to decline due to the very mild improvement in new home sales and still low sentiment among home purchasers. Property firm investment, a lagging indicator of the property sector, has yet to bottom out." End quote. Some voices argue that the crisis, though painful, can still be managed. We end part 1 on the property crisis with comments made this week by Xianglong Wang and Keji, financial specialist at the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office in Singapore, in an opinion piece published in Japan-based Nikkei Asia Today. We are now quoting selected excerpts of this opinion piece directly. "China has recognized the need to stabilize its property sector and keep developers' severe financial problems from spilling over further into banking and other key sectors of the economy or even affecting other nations. The real estate sector accounts for nearly 30% of China's gross domestic product. About 40% of outstanding bank loans were issued to developers and home buyers. Land sales to developers have also long been a key source of revenue for local governments. The risk of spillover from property market distress is especially high because many of China's large developers have expanded well beyond the real estate sector, venturing into areas including agriculture, automobiles, healthcare, entertainment, and tourism. Around 45% of Chinese property companies are at risk of debt distress, although a broad-based collapse of the property market has so far been averted. More developers continue to run into trouble." And remember, this is one of the more optimistic opinion pieces on China's property crisis. We continue with the quote. "At this point, it would make sense for the government to look at restructuring the debt of troubled large developers through steps such as lengthening borrowing terms and trimming interest rates. As an aside, we note that this would, of course, put much more strain on already highly stressed Chinese banks." We continue. "For property companies that really prove non-viable, assets and business lines should be gradually pared down through sales. Where there is little prospect of sale, operations can be wound down and liquidated to bring the company back to a manageable size. Robust macroeconomic policies should be consistently in place to ensure that loans are prudent right from inception. The integrity of the banking sector should be strengthened through better transparency and improvements in corporate governance. By employing comprehensive measures, China's financial landscape can be fortified. This would help to safeguard systemic stability and resilience against shocks in the property sector. A stronger policy framework, in turn, will reduce the risk of any reflation of the country's real estate bubble." We will see if this optimism is well placed or just wishful thinking. Next up, and finally for today. This week saw the death of former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at the age of 100. In the West, Kissinger remains a deeply divisive figure, and debate around his legacy will no doubt continue to rage on. However, in China, he is an almost universally beloved figure, called an old friend in official and state media descriptions. On the news of his death, Xi Jinping sent a message of condolence to Joe Biden. Premier Li Qiang and top diplomat Wang Yi also both sent similar messages to Kissinger's family and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. At a press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said that Kissinger was an, quote, old friend and dear friend of the Chinese people, end quote, and, quote, a pioneer and builder of U.S.-China relations, end quote. Kissinger, under U.S. President Nixon, was a key figure in the normalization of Sino-U.S. relations over half a century ago, starting from 1971, and has visited China over 100 times. In 1989, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, Kissinger traveled to Beijing in an effort to avoid a complete collapse in U.S.-China relations. He has met with every major Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, including Xi Jinping just a few months ago. While no doubt a brilliant diplomat and a leading expert in modern European political, diplomatic, and geopolitical history, many scholars and commentators, including yours truly, have been less impressed with his academic credentials as a China expert. Elizabeth Economy, for example, a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, criticized Kissinger's 2011 book on China as viewing China through too narrow a lens. I tend to agree. His book on China, in my humble opinion, also adopts modern Chinese nationalist narratives about China's modern history whole cloth without critically examining them, and tells China's story almost exclusively through the eyes of China's top leaders. Part of this may be because he has made a lot of money with his consulting firm, which connected business people overseas with Chinese officials. To be fair, in an interview with Chinese media in 2013, Kissinger himself admitted that academically he was not a China expert, but his knowledge was in, quote, knowing each generation of Chinese leaders, end quote. In his final years, Kissinger became especially concerned about the acute deterioration of U.S.-China relations. To ease tensions, he proposed a two-pronged U.S. policy. First, demanding China's respect and sticking to core U.S. principles, while second, maintaining constant dialogue and finding areas for cooperation. During his meeting with Xi Jinping a few months ago, Kissinger told the General Secretary that U.S.-China relations are crucial for the peace and prosperity of the two countries and the world. Speaking back in the U.S., Kissinger warned of the, quote, colossal danger if China and the U.S. were to enter a second Cold War, end quote, which would pose a, quote, greater risk to the world than the first Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, end quote, in his words. In a 2015 interview, Kissinger warned, quote, I believe that none of the leaders who started the First World War would have done so had they had known what the end would look like. So, China and the US have to be careful not to get into this situation where even if they act reasonably, they create tension that, over a period of time, will be difficult to manage, end quote. 8 years later, Kissinger passes from a world which very much may be at this very point. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Friday, and I will see you all tomorrow.